Welcome to Plotline Rundown, where we look at classic comic book plotlines and give you a summary so you can pick up on modern references to them. Also, hopefully go out and read them yourself. With Captain America Civil War coming out, people have started to once again take interest in one of the most important Marvel storylines of all time, the Civil War. Written by Mark Millar and including tie-ins to almost every book Marvel was producing, Civil War spoke directly to the time and place it was published, which is to say George W. Bush's America. By 2006, we had gotten over much of our blind nationalism and fear of 9/11 style terrorism, igniting a debate about the correct balance between freedom and security. Ultimately, Civil War is about using the Marvel heroes to represent that debate. I've heard a lot of complaints about it being a big excuse to have heroes fight one another, and that's not wrong. It is written by Mark Millar, who hates superheroes that aren't Superman, and hates you as well, personally. But you can't honestly represent that debate if there aren't people we like and trust on both sides of the argument. Heroes have to fight heroes because we need to see that neither side is evil. Both can overstep their bounds, and it's a complex issue. Well, that is until the end, when Millar just says that the side that won was right the whole time because he can only do clever and subtle by accident. Either way, because of how big it was and how far-reaching, many of the events of this book are still being felt in the Marvel Universe 10 years and several major events and crossovers later. As Crisis on Infinite Earths is to DC as far as importance goes, Civil War is to Marvel. Alright, now that we have the context out of the way, let's get into the stats. Main heroes, all of the heroes. Even the obscure ones. If they were near Earth, they're involved. Marvel really dug deep for this one. Main villains, all of the heroes. This is more of a protagonist-antagonist than hero-villain thing, though Baron Zemo does have a plan that's touched on in the main book, but only really addressed in a tie-in. By the way, get used to that. Number of issues, 7 technically. With tie-ins this is actually 193 issues, but we'll only be covering the main book here today. Barrier to entry. Again, this is my rating for how easy it is for somebody who knows very little or nothing about the comic to pick it up, from low being a first issue to impossible being a major event like Crisis on Infinite Earths. Civil War is difficult to jump into. It references a lot of obscure characters and teams as major plot points. Many of the things that are part of the common understanding of the Marvel status quo are different at this point. For example, Danny Rand is filling in as Daredevil while Matt Murdock is in prison. And the book doesn't do a whole lot to catch up casual fans who might be unfamiliar with the Young Avengers or why Thor isn't around. You can figure it all out with some Googling or just struggling through with the context, but it's tough. Issue 1 starts with the most insidious creation of the mid-noughties, reality television. The New Warriors, a group of small-time heroes like Speedball and Namorita, have their own show where they hunt down supervillains and beat them on camera. Recently, Nova left the team, so they had been having trouble finding villains to face. In fact, we learned from Speedball and his stupid face that they actually harassed a homeless person just to have something to do. So, they are super excited that they found a house in Stamford, Connecticut with 4 big names on the FBI Most Wanted list. Coldheart spots them, and realizing they're going to be on TV, runs inside to tell everybody to get into costume instead of running away. Microbe makes a gay joke because Millar is so classy. Namorita chases down Nitro, pushing him into a bus parked outside the elementary school across the street. When she tries to get him to surrender, Nitro blows up. Unfortunately, he's more powerful than he's ever been before, and in one of the most tragic scenes I've ever read in comics, he kills Namorita, most of the New Warriors, and 900 citizens of Stamford, including 66 children at the school they were in front of. I don't have a joke for that. Tony and Cap have a conversation about how Speedball should have called them, how there's tape of him saying that they were looking for ratings, and how it looks bad for everyone, while Miss Marvel suggests that maybe any negative reaction they got from the public was deserved, starting a grand tradition in this story of not being able to tell the difference between heroes and villains. We see some reactions to this disaster, including Father Douchebag here being passive-aggressive and Tony getting spit on by the Crow. This is Miriam Sharp, the mother of one of the Stanford victims, and a staple of the Marvel U from this point well into Fear itself. In this case, she also serves as a stand-in for Mylar, who, let me remind you, doesn't like superheroes. Next, she's going to call a bunch of kids nerds, but first she has to tell us how Iron Man is responsible for Nitro blowing people up. J. Jonah Jameson makes sure that Peter Parker is, quote, getting this, apparently unaware that that kind of camera doesn't capture moving video or audio. We shift locations to... things turn ugly, apparently. I hear that's near the village. Johnny storms his way into the scene, showing up late for a date where he's as thoroughly unlikable as human torchly possible. When he makes it clear that he thinks he's better than everybody else there, a crowd already inclined to blame superheroes for the Stanford disaster starts making a fuss. Using all the PR and diplomacy skills he learned from years with the Fantastic Four, Johnny gets a bottle broken over his head and ends up in a coma. At the Baxter Building, many of the biggest names in the superhero community have gathered and are having a lot of conversation fragments composed exclusively of clunky, expository dialogue. The idea is to have all people with powers agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. They would have training, direction, salaries, pensions, vacation time, and all the benefits of regular employment. In exchange, S.H.I.E.L.D. knows who they are, and they are expected to do the work they're told to do. Tony, Hank Pym, and several other heroes in fairly stable situations think this is a great idea, but Wolverine and others tell them to, well, check their privilege in not so many words. Meanwhile, on the helicarrier, there was only one at this point, Maria Hill, acting director of S.H.I.E.L.D., has a conversation where she explains the plan to Captain America, who says everything short of, "This would cause a civil war!" He makes a rather lame argument that masked heroes are a tradition, and Maria makes an even lamer argument that apparently so is smallpox. When they realize that neither knows how rational arguments work, Cap escapes being arrested for pissing off Maria Hill, I guess, which is a capital offense. He then surfs a fighter jet away. The Watcher appears back at the Baxter Building so everyone can say, "Ooh, that's probably bad." And after that, we jump to Washington, D.C., and back in time to a mythical era when dozens of dead children was actually cause for congressional action. The issue ends with Yellow Jacket, Mr. Fantastic, and Iron Man promising the President that they'll take care of Captain America. Issue 2 opens with a full-page advertise for the movie Click, which does not bode well for anybody. Captain America has gone underground, beating up villains and leaving them chained to things for S.H.I.E.L.D. to pick up, often so quiet and inconspicuous that nobody knows he was there. Meanwhile, the pro-registration heroes are on the streets of New York high-fiving next to a building they've set on fire while fighting this giant Doombot. You know, because they're so much more careful and concerned about lives and property damage than Cap. Inexplicably, the people of New York love this, and since they're nothing but props to tell me how I should feel, I love it too. Back at the Baxter Building, Reed is too distracted to pay much attention to Sue, sure that his calculations are correct and the Superhero Registration Act is the only way to avert a social collapse. Sue discovers a disc marked 42 that Reed says is classified, and if you're waiting for a big reveal of what it is in the main book, you're going to be disappointed, since by the time we return to it, everybody knows what it is already because it was covered in a tie-in. Sue decides to visit Johnny in the hospital, while the Thing sits in the dark playing a board game with Franklin and Valeria. In Tony's penthouse, Stark talks with somebody who is too easy to see for it to be a shocking surprise, but too difficult to identify to know who it is. Probably Happy Hogan. They speak in pregnant dialogue about how important this moment is, then it strikes midnight and the act goes into effect, making everybody who didn't sign up a criminal. 24 hours later, we pick up with Patriot of the Young Avengers, who is running from a helicopter. The guy manning the machine gun says he was stopping a robbery in costume, which apparently is punished by summary execution since he opens fire on the kid. Fortunately, his armor protects him long enough for him to get into an abandoned building. Then the helicopter... Wait, fires missiles at him? For stopping a robbery in costume? Oh, wait, no, it's just gas. Exploding gas! On street level, the rest of the Young Avengers are being loaded into a S.H.I.E.L.D. prisoner transport. Fortunately, when nameless obligatory loudmouth reiterates the pro-registration side for the audience and, apparently David Bowie, he gets kicked out of the cab. Turns out that's actually Captain David Bowie, with Falcon in the back who convinces Wiccan to use his magic to teleport the whole transport away, something that Wiccan probably should have thought of himself. Back at base, we find out that Captain America is, in fact, Superman. He watches TV as Tony is about to present something very special. As the book ends, Spider-Man, in front of an international television audience, removes his mask and announces his secret identity. Soak in this panel, because from here on out, we're on a downward spiral to one more day. Issue 3 picks up where we left off with Peter at the press conference, but that only lasts for one panel when we switch to Wakanda, apparently in the Black Panther City, where T'Challa and Reed meet outside in the rain so their meeting will be more dramatic. For all their advanced technology, apparently Wakanda has yet to invent conference rooms. Reed tells T'Challa that confidence in superheroes is at an all-time low, despite a month previous Tony congratulating his team on the sound of people believing in superheroes again. Turns out Reed is there to ask T'Challa to help hunt down anyone who doesn't want to join one of the 50 state-based superhero teams Tony is creating with registered superhumans. The King of Wakanda refuses, seeing as how he's a foreign head of state and doesn't want to meddle in the affairs of the United States. When he asks about Johnny, Reed admits that he hasn't checked in for a few days, but Sue is keeping an eye on her brother. He immediately tries to change the subject, but T'Challa tells him to call Sue. We drop into the Sanctum Sanctorum just to see Wong tell Hank Pym that Doc Strange won't support Tony and has gone into seclusion to fast until they work things out. We then go to the X-Menton, Westchester State, where Tony is trying to get Emma Frost to bring the mutants on board. A Sentinel watches over the Xavier School to protect them, since there is at this point less than 200 mutants in the world, most of whom live on the grounds like a reservation that they can't leave unaccompanied. Frost not only points out that this is exactly the Mutant Registration Act again, but that Tony has no idea what it's like to be persecuted while fighting for what's right. She also says that his attempt to emotionally blackmailing her by talking about the children who died in Stanford would be less condescending if the Avengers hadn't stood by while 16 million mutants were slaughtered on Genosha only a few years previous. Ultimately, Emma agrees to remain neutral, but if Tony tries to press them into service, they'll join up with Cap. Before Tony can leave, Bishop gets his attention from the bushes in a setup that, again, will never be touched on in the main book, and you have to read the tie-in to get. Another abrupt scene change later, and we're back in New York, where the panels show us that Captain America, Hercules, Daredevil, and Goliath are all now donning disguises and discussing their cover stories in public like normal people who are not superheroes on the run from authorities do all the time. Admittedly, this is one of my favorite scenes in the whole storyline as Cap looks out the window, thinking about the kid from the Make-A-Wish Foundation he was supposed to play catch with, but can't because S.H.I.E.L.D. would know to look for him there. For a moment, the story shows us that the cost of this fight is larger than just secret identities and costumes. As Cap says, it's the little things they've stolen from us with this registration garbage, the little things that make us who we are. For a brief moment, the story becomes about more than just politics and heroes fighting. It becomes about identity and whether we have a responsibility to be people we aren't for the good of everybody else. But we certainly can't let that sink in or anything. Goliath gets a text about a petrochemical plant that's on fire with 300 or 400 people inside, so the team costumes up and heads to the scene. Unsurprisingly, they arrive and, well... It's a trap! Huh. Where'd that clip come from? Anyway, Stark is there with a bunch of other heroes and a S.H.I.E.L.D. team that hits several of the rebels with power suppressants. Tony gives them a promise of amnesty if they surrender, but Cap refuses. When Spidey tries to point out that nobody wins if they're fighting one another, Cap gives up on a chance to make a real point by being petty. Still, Tony removes his mask and tries to convince Steve that things have changed since his day, that people don't want masked crusaders anymore, they want stability. He asks for a chance to explain his plans, and Cap shakes his hand saying he'll give Tony 5 minutes. Unfortunately, that was a lie, and Captain America, the most honorable of heroes, a symbol of integrity, planted a device that would short out Tony's armor. At least we're lucky he didn't take this opportunity to make a joke about how cowardly the French are this time. The meeting devolves into chaos as heroes fight one another. Spider-Man, decked out in his own armor designed by Tony, is kicking all sorts of butt and buys Iron Man time to reboot and get back into the fight. This is where we find out that S.H.I.E.L.D. actually calls their own anti-superhuman units Cape Killers. I get that the rebels call them that, it's meant to overplay how aggressive they are and drum up sympathy. But when S.H.I.E.L.D. does it, it just sounds like they're abandoning any pretense of trying to capture and detain violators. Again, this is just really poor writing. Hercules sees that Iron Man is beating Cap to death and Cap is refusing to give in. When he runs over to help, though, he and several of the rebels are suddenly hit by lightning. This comes as a much bigger surprise when you realize that Thor is supposed to be dead right now, but there he stands, Mjolnir held aloft, staring down the anti-registration side as the issue comes to an end. Issue 4 starts with everybody shocked to see their old friend back. Dagger exclaims, "Everybody thought you were dead." In the ancient Asgardian tradition of "I'm rubber, you're glue," Thor replies, "No, Dagger, that would be you," and starts attacking the assembled anti-registration heroes as if he were fighting Thanos. Iron Man begs Cap to stay down, but again Cap has to throw an insult rather than being written with any sort of dignity. Tony activates a high-pitched tone that's supposed to put the rebels out cold, but Steve refuses to stay down. Fortunately, he's saved by Hercules, who throws a tanker truck at Iron Man, which blows up and stops the squealing. The battle continues as Falcon swoops in to save Cap, and Goliath faces off against Thor. Without even thinking about it, Thor points his hammer at Goliath, firing a blast of lightning through the other hero's chest. killing him instantly. The fight stops as the giant body collapses to the ground. Everybody's shocked at what just happened. Falcon breaks them out of it, telling the side to fall back as Thor prepares to slaughter them all. But when he calls down lightning on the assembled rebels, it bounces off an invisible shield. Sue Storm, standing in the dramatic rain with blood running down her nose, has switched sides. This panel is amazing. Falcon thanks Sue before Cloak teleports them out. Once they leave, we discover that Thor is either a robot or really hates opera. Sue's pissed, and the rest of the remaining heroes look over Goliath's body. "I thought you said you knew what you were doing, Tony. I thought we were doing this so no one else gets hurt," says Spider-Man. Uatu shows up to both witness and share in their sorrow. Back at Avengers Tower, we see that this Thor is a cyborg, and Reed is trying to figure out what went wrong. Hank in particular is having trouble with things. Pym asks Spider-Man if he thinks he's so detached and cold that he wouldn't be affected watching one of his oldest friends murdered in front of him. Turns out that this Thor was part cyborg and part clone based on a strand of the real Thor's hair from the first Avengers meeting. Pym, of course, did the robotics, maintaining his nearly perfect record of accidentally designing killer robots. Meanwhile, the secret Avengers HQ, Steve is sitting in the most sciencey chair they own, pointing out that while this is a tragedy, it's hurting Tony's side. Because Captain America would care about that in this situation. Of course, at least a couple of Cap's heroes, specifically Nighthawk and Stature, have decided that this death makes the fight no longer worth it. They jump sides with Cap's blessing? Childish derision? Something like that. And as they leave through a back alley, we see they're being watched. At Goliath's funeral, we get another visit from Miriam Sharp. She points out that Goliath was breaking the law and therefore deserved to die, then gives Tony her son's Iron Man action figure because his life was actually meaningful. Peter, MJ, and Aunt May stay apart from everybody else as they stand in the dramatic rain. The issue ends with a letter from Sue to Reed explaining that she can no longer be with him after Goliath's murder. She and Johnny would be leaving to join the Underground. Ben Grimm watches them walk out into the dramatic rain, seeing his family torn apart by this. Oh wait, that would have been the place to end the issue, but instead there's one more scene where we find out that so many people have abandoned the pro-registration side that they have to start using the Thunderbolts team they put together, made entirely of imprisoned supervillains. Because this looks like an awesome idea and a great way to ruin an otherwise beautiful previous scene. Issue 5 opens with the fantastic aerial ballet, which, as we all know, is done boobs first. Johnny and Sue are escaping from S.H.I.E.L.D., and they do. Gotta keep things moving or we might not have time for Nighthawk and Stature to talk with Happy about registering and make another oblique reference to Cap being out of touch and so very old. And then we shift upstairs where Peter and Tony are arguing because Peter's leaving the Avengers. Turns out that a bunch of stuff happened in the tie-ins that we didn't see in the main book, so when he mentions locking heroes in the negative zone, you might be confused. Don't worry, it's not you, it's bad writing. Tony, the suave genius, just starts throwing out excuses like he's trying to gish-gallop Peter into staying, and they spend several pages fighting, because it's necessary to put that in and not explain any of the plot threads that have been left hanging. Spidey escapes, and the book neglects to mention that registration apparently means conscription into a superhero team. Remember that for later. Maria Hill activates some of the Thunderbolts to go after Spidey, and again, reminding us that live capture is not something they're interested in, she sends the Jester and Jack-o'-lantern, both Spider-Man villains. Unsurprisingly, they start to beat Peter to death with the intention of saying that he resisted arrest, but just when things look their worst, Jack's head... Pumpkinhead? Explodes, and we see somebody has rescued Peter. Back at Rebel HQ, the heroes are discussing everything that has happened in tie-in books that they are suddenly aware of, including that Cloak and Dagger have been captured in Queens, and they also know about the Negative Zone prison called Prison 42. Remember that top-secret CD from earlier? Wouldn't it have been cool to find out what it was in the book itself rather than through dialogue? I thought so. A figure shows up in the doorway and we find out that it's the Punisher carrying the badly hurt Spider-Man, a surprise so big that it causes Captain America to have a stroke. Turns out Punisher has been weighing his options, studying the size, and deciding who to join. He was Ski Mask Guy from earlier, remember? Anyway, he's decided to join up with Cap because Tony has been hiring murderers for the Thunderbolts. They decide to let Frank join the Underground since he has Special Forces training that they need to get into the Baxter building and steal the plans for Prison 42. Speaking of which, in Hell's Kitchen, Daredevil's been captured and Reed lets us know what's happening. Apparently, everybody loves registration except for the people affected by it. Moreover, he contemplates the last few days. Sometimes I wish we'd never gotten involved. Do you ever stop to think how much easier things would be if we hadn't spliced Thor's DNA with Hank Pym's cybertech? If we didn't have this big final battle planned with all those Thunderbolt lunatics? You know, Reed, now that you say it out loud, it sounds kind of stupid, doesn't it? Also, what big final battle? Oh, right, happened in the tie-ins. Also, apparently Hank is, quote, doped up on antidepressants, which would be good to see. Unfortunately, it is, you guessed it, in a tie-in. At Rikers Island, Tony tries to yet again explain himself to somebody as they bring Daredevil through the portal to the negative zone. While he does this a lot, I kinda like it. In the hands of a better writer, I can imagine this being Tony trying to justify his actions to himself, even though it mostly comes off as him trying to justify it to us, the reader. Still, I can respect what this could have been. Daredevil refuses to talk to him at first, just giving Stark a silver dollar. When Iron Man doesn't get it, Danny explains that he now has 31 pieces of silver. The line is clunky and would have made more sense coming from very Catholic Matt Murdock instead of Taoist Danny Rand, but it brings the point across. The book ends with Danny saying, "Sleep well, Judas," in case you didn't get it before. Book 6 opens at a SHIELD base in Arizona, where they're building new superhero teams as part of the 50-state initiative, a plan to assign one superhero team to each state, making it the least efficient model they could have devised. We learn the names of some of the teams, including the Champions for California, those Mormon heroes for Utah, of course, and the Space Knights for the great state of Chicago. That also makes sense because Chicago is known for its connection to space and Space Knights specifically. If only there were a Marvel character who was a Space Knight. Maybe they could see what state he spent his time in and assign that team there where they would be familiar with the name, like maybe West Virginia. I think S.H.I.E.L.D. should consider firing their marketing team. At the Baxter building, Reed has been working on Robo-Thor and seems to be over that whole homicidal robot thing. I mean, if building a killer cyborg stopped him from trying, he would never get anything done. Mr. Fantastic tells Tony that he doesn't plan to help anymore unless he gets a promise that Sue and Johnny would be among the 12 heroes that could be given prosecutorial immunity. Because Reed believes in justice above all else, just like he's been saying this whole time. While that's going on, Punisher is breaking into the Baxter building. Cap is giving him orders and asks if Frank can steal the plans without shooting anybody in the head. Hilarious, says Frank, and actually it kinda is. Meanwhile, in Atlantis, Sue Storm is trying to get Namor to join up with Cap's side. This is actually a really canny move since Namor has a long-standing crush on Sue, so much so that he was part of a love triangle in early FF issues before she married Reed. Namor had wanted revenge earlier in one of the tie-ins because it was his cousin, Namorita, that was Nitro's first victim, but since he's gotten a hold of the murderer, he now doesn't really care. Namor sees right through the ploy of sending his old flame to ask for help, acting very cold and distant, demanding that she refer to him by his title, calling her Mrs. Richards. In much the same way that Sue flies breast first, Namor apparently walks crotch first as he goes over to remind her that there was a time when she found his repeatedly kidnapping her very erotic, and maybe still does. Meanwhile, over at the Secret Avengersville, we find out that his royal sultriness said no, Doc Strange is somewhere else, and the mutants are staying out of the fight except for Storm, who's married to Black Panther, and both are upset at seeing a black man shot by a cop with no apparent repercussions. Since Punisher managed to get a hold of the schematics, they now know exactly what Prison 42 is like. They also have the code to access it from the Rikers Island gate. They're worried they don't have enough people, but Diamondback reveals that several lower-level supervillains, represented here by Goldbug and Plunderer, are willing to throw in on Cap's side. They don't want to live in a police state any more than Cap's people, and are willing to put aside their criminal ways to help out. It makes sense that Diamondback would be the one that they came to since she's a reformed villain, and used to be part of the Serpent Society. Unfortunately, Frank Castle is played here by a cartoon version of himself and shoots the two villains where they stand, not even seeming to be aware that he did something wrong. Cap loses it, beating Castle to within an inch of his life. Wow, there's a lot of beating people nearly to death in this. Only stopping when he realizes that Frank isn't fighting back. There's a good reason for that too, which is covered in a tie-in. Back in Stamford, Tony is dedicating a public garden to the victims of the disaster, assuring Miriam Sharp that he knew this sort of thing would happen with the rebel heroes and is willing to endure it. And since that was so very necessary, the other half of the page is given to Doc Strange, who's having a conversation with Uatu, though the fact that he hasn't eaten since the war began implies that maybe he's only hallucinating the Watcher. Uatu asks him why he doesn't use his magic to fix everything, and Strange replies that it's not his place to make that kind of decision. Neither side is objectively right, they both have a point of sorts, and having the power to decide between them means that he has to be even more careful about how he uses that power. Instead, he's hoping for the best result for everybody that sheds the least amount of blood. As the sun sets on Rikers Island, the Underground takes out the only 2 guards left on the gate and travels through. Once they get to the other side, Spider-Man's spider sense is tingling off the charts. When they look up, Team Iron Man and the Thunderbolts are waiting for them. Once again, it was a trap, but the twist is that Team Iron Man has had a mole the entire time. Cap, in a show of manly one-upmanship, says that he knew Tigra was a spy and they found it out because Hank Pym was replaced that morning by the shapeshifter Hulkling. And since Hulkling could mimic even Hank's voice and retinal pattern, he opened up the cells of the heroes trapped in 42. The issue ends with the 2 sides facing off against one another and Cap saying, "Close your eyes, gentlemen. This might hurt." Appropriately enough, we begin our last issue with Cap yelling, "Avengers, assemble!" and Bishop pointing out that their side should technically be the Avengers before being smashed into the floor by Steve's big red irony boot. Black Panther is taking over S.H.I.E.L.D.'s computers so that he can keep the portal open long enough for Cloak to teleport over 100 people, all of whom are fighting out of the negative zone and to someplace else. And someplace else seems to be in the air outside the Baxter building. Iron Man calls for an evacuation of the area so the fight can continue and backhands Johnny Storm to boot. Spider-Man takes on 5 guys without breaking stride on his way to kick Reed in the face. Amazing. Spectacular. 2099! Cap is not doing so well. Venom, Bullseye, Taskmaster, and Lady Deathstrike seem to have him on the ropes. What's so funny, Captain? You like our little jokes? You share Bullseye's sense of humor? No, I'm just thinking about my pal up there kicking your butts into next week. What? And then, in one of the coolest panels in the story, Namor and his Atlantean armies come rushing into battle as he shouts his catchphrase. Imperious Rex! But just as it looks like Team Cap has an advantage, turns out Team Iron Man also has some reserves, including Robo-Thor, because there's no better way to test your mecha-clone murder machine's newfound restraint than in pitched battle with hundreds of people. Ben Grimm suddenly shows up, having returned from France. What? You didn't know that the Thing went to France? Probably because it happened, say it with me now, in a tie-in. Since the last we saw of the ever-loving blue-eyed Thing, he was staring into the dramatic rain, Sue's surprise and his reference to eating croissants seems to come out of nowhere. If you were reading this alone, then you would assume that he was about to have breakfast when he saw 100 people rain down outside the window and decided to come downstairs to see what's up. As Sue talks with Ben, Taskmaster takes aim at her, but Reed selflessly jumps in the way. As he lies on the ground and Ben reacts in a really awkward tone, Sue turns furiously on Taskmaster and uses her powers to flatten him 6 inches into the pavement. In another part of the battle, Hercules and Thor have fought to a standstill. Thor poses for a heavy metal album cover while Herc calmly picks up Cyber Mjolnir and raises it over his head, referencing the 1988 American vice presidential debate. Seriously, look up that wording and replace Thor with Jack Kennedy. Senator, thou art no Thor! At the center of this mess is Steve and Tony, and we get the mirror image of the battle from the chemical plant. Now, instead of Tony beating Steve into a bloody pulp, it's Steve who keeps hitting Tony with his shield over and over again, clearly inverting its purpose from defense to bloody offense. Stark tells him to finish it, and for a moment it looks like Cap may kill his friend, when a bunch of ordinary citizens jump on him and hold him back. Finally, the fighting slows to a halt as Captain America realizes what he's done. Clearly, the people that he thinks he's fighting for don't want him to fight anymore. He removes his mask in an act of symbolic significance and surrenders, telling his army to stand down. By way of first epilogue, we're treated to a letter from Reed to Sue, starting by talking about how hard it is to think slow enough to be able to write like normal people. Other than the douchebaggery, we learn that 2 weeks have passed and a general amnesty has been given to the Underground members that registered. The initiative is launched at a press conference attended by Valley Girl Carol Danvers. Like, isn't our superhero team so totally radical? Despite the big plans that everyone has for the initiative, though, Reed admits that none of it matters to him as long as she's not there. As he turns from the dramatic rain, he sees Sue standing in the doorway. Her face is cautious, but she's willing to try. Meanwhile, 5 miles over New York, Tony hosts Miriam Sharp on the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier. turns out that the president has made him the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. due to his links between the government and the superhero community. After being a dick to Maria Hill, who was literally passed over for the role, he explains that the reason why Prison 42 was called that was that it was the 42nd of 100 ideas that Tony, Reed, and Hank came up with to make a better world. Next is cleaning up S.H.I.E.L.D. Miriam Sharp tries once more to convince us that Tony was right all along, and the story ends with the two of them looking out on a bright new horizon. Civil War as a standalone story falls apart because it's simply too big for 7 books, even if they are oversized. Millar drops so many hints that never go anywhere unless you read the tie-ins, and introduces concepts that were covered elsewhere but are completely new to the casual reader. That being said, if you're willing to delve into the tie-ins, this becomes one of the best storylines ever written. Not just at Marvel, in comic books. While not just a collection of moments, some stand out that I wish could have been in the regular book. Like in New Avengers 22, when Luke Cage tells Jessica that he won't register. And later, when the people in his building ask what he'll do, he tells them, "I'm gonna go inside and sit in my home, and not bother no one. You're supposed to be allowed to do that, right?" Or watching Robbie Baldwin, Speedball, deal with his guilt over what happened while in prison, simultaneously finding out that his powers have morphed and he now gets energy from feeling pain, leading him to change his identity to Penance. Or seeing Reed Richards get the Thinker out of jail because he's the only one that can understand Reed's math that convinced him registration was necessary, and Reed needed somebody, anybody, even an enemy, to tell him what he was doing is the right thing. My favorite book is Frontline, which follows reporters Ben Urich and Sally Floyd as they investigate this war, getting stories from all sorts of people, heroes, villains, civilians, officials. It gives characters a chance to talk about what's in their heads and fleshes out the world in a way the main books "everybody loves registration except for those big, out-of-touch meanie heads" utterly fails to do. Some of you may have heard that this is also the storyline that kills Captain America. That doesn't happen until all this is over, when Steve is on his way to be tried for being a non-registrant. But yes, this is what leads to that. So if you're willing to try some of the tie-ins, I think you'll get a lot out of this. If you read the main book, it's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but you're getting a series of snapshots of a much bigger story, and it's hard to believe that some of the snapshots aren't missing. So, what did we learn? 1. Reality TV literally kills people. 2. Rushing through legislation that has a serious impact on a group of people might have unintended consequences. 3. Captured alive is not a task best done by squads called Cape Killers. 4. Hank Pym needs to stop making robots. And 5. The people of New York always know the right thing to do. Don't think. Listen to the masses and they will figure out how you should feel and believe. That's it for Civil War Plotline Rundown. If there are comic book storylines you want me to cover here, leave them in the comments. If you're Team Cap, like and subscribe to support his fight for freedom. If you're Team Iron Man, like and subscribe to protect civilians from untrained, unaccountable super people. Thanks for watching.